In the quietest corners of Harvard, where genius is expected, but miracles are rare, a struggling single father mopped floors under the heavy weight of dreams long abandoned. Until one night at 2 a.m., when a forgotten equation and a woman with a guitar changed everything. This is a story about hope, reborn in the most unlikely hour, about a heart that refused to give up, and another that dared to believe again. If stories of resilience, kindness, and second chances touch your heart, we invite you to subscribe and join our growing community. Your presence helps us keep bringing light into the quiet places of the world. Now, let's begin. The halls of Harvard stood empty at 2 a.m., breathing a silence so heavy it almost hummed. The polished marble floors reflected the dim overhead lights, and the air smelled faintly of chalk dust, old books, and a lingering sense of dreams, either fulfilled or forgotten. David Miller moved through the corridors with quiet precision, mop in one hand, a bucket trailing behind him on squeaky wheels. His worn work boots muffled against the floor as he cleaned room after room with the patience of a man who had long since stopped hoping for applause or even acknowledgement. Behind him, padding softly like a shadow, was Max, 8 years old, small for his age, eyes too old for his face. Max carried a battered notebook clutched to his chest like a shield. He didn't speak, not anymore, not since they had lost Emily, the wife David had loved beyond words, the mother Max had adored with all the bright, careless love of a child who believed goodbyes were never permanent. David glanced back at his son. Max shuffled along, head down, the sleeves of his jacket slightly too long, hiding his small hands. Something twisted deep in David's chest. He had thought that time would heal. He was wrong. Time, it seemed, only taught you how to live around the emptiness. "Almost done, buddy," David said, his voice soft, careful, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile world they were barely holding together. Max said nothing. David sighed and pushed open the door to classroom 3B, a vast lecture hall with high windows and long wooden benches worn smooth by generations of restless students. He flicked on the lights. Fluorescent buzz filled the room. In a distant corner, a blackboard loomed, half-erased equations scrawled across its face like the remnants of forgotten dreams. As he set the mop aside, David found his eyes drawn, inevitably, to the blackboard. Lines of mathematical beauty stretched across it, partial derivatives, elegant curves, complex algorithms. For a moment, the weight of exhaustion slipped from David's shoulders. Here, in these symbols, was a language he still spoke fluently, a world he once belonged to before grief had turned him into a stranger to himself. Without thinking, he picked up a piece of chalk. He should have mopped the floor, finished the shift, taken Max home. But something ancient stirred inside him, a longing so raw it made his fingers ache. Gently, David added a line to the half-erased equation. And another. Max, who had curled up against one of the wooden benches, looked up from his notebook. David smiled faintly. "Just a minute, Max." He worked quietly, the chalk tapping in soft rhythms against the board. Numbers, symbols, variables. They flowed from his mind effortlessly, like a melody remembered after too long in silence. His heart, numb for so long, began to beat with something close to hope. From the corner of his eye, David noticed Max sitting up straighter. The boy watched intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Max opened his battered notebook and began copying the symbols. David blinked. His throat tightened. Was it possible? After months of silence, months of blank stares and empty afternoons, was this the spark that could reach his son? He dropped to one knee beside Max. "You like that, buddy?" he asked gently. Max didn't answer with words. Instead, he jabbed a tiny finger at a crooked line in his notebook, looking up at David with eyes wide and questioning. David chuckled softly, tears burning at the corners of his eyes. "Close," he whispered. "Let me show you." He took the boy's hand, guided the pencil carefully across the page, correcting the equation. Max watched, rapt, his small fingers trembling slightly. But his eyes, God, his eyes, alive again with something David hadn't seen in so long. Wonder. The clock on the wall ticked toward 2:15 a.m. The building around them creaked with the slow, patient breath of an old institution. Outside, snow fell silently, cloaking the campus in white. David and Max sat together on the cold floor, two small islands of warmth in the vast, indifferent ocean of academia. He knew this couldn't fix everything. It wouldn't bring Emily back. It wouldn't erase the nights Max woke screaming, the quiet dinners eaten without laughter, the birthdays celebrated with only a single candle. But maybe, just maybe, it was a beginning. A soft scraping sound broke the moment. David turned his head sharply. Standing just outside the open doorway, half shrouded in shadow, was a woman. Slim, with a long coat dusted in snow. She held a guitar case loosely in one hand. Her face was obscured by the angle of the dim hallway light, but David could see the surprise frozen in her posture, the way her fingers tightened slightly around the guitar. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then she stepped into the light. She was younger than David expected, maybe mid-30s, with dark, serious eyes and an expression that was part curiosity, part something deeper. Recognition, perhaps. David rose slowly, instinctively shielding Max behind him. The woman smiled, a tentative, almost shy curve of her lips. Then, without a word, she set down her guitar case and began to tune the strings. Soft notes floated through the room, gentle and familiar. A simple country song, the kind David hadn't heard since his own childhood in rural Maine. It filled the sterile lecture hall with something it hadn't known in a long time. Home. Max peeked out from behind David's legs, eyes wide. The woman caught his gaze and, still playing, nodded slightly, as if inviting him to step closer. David knelt again, placing a reassuring hand on Max's back. "Go on," he whispered. And so Max did. One small step toward the music. One small step back toward life. David watched them, his heart aching in that beautiful, unbearable way that only hope could create. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to imagine that maybe, just maybe, tomorrow could be different from today. Maybe the halls wouldn't be silent forever. Maybe hearts, too, could learn to sing again. The morning sun broke timidly over the spires of Harvard, casting long, golden rays across the frost-covered grounds. From their modest apartment a few miles away, David and Max prepared for another quiet day, their breaths visible in the chill that the old heater couldn't quite defeat. David stirred oatmeal on the stove, glancing at Max, who sat at the worn kitchen table with his battered notebook open, doodling quietly. Not monsters, not spaceships like most boys his age. No, Max was sketching numbers. David's hand trembled slightly as he set two bowls on the table. He wasn't sure what last night had meant. The woman with the guitar. Max's sudden interest. It all felt fragile, like a soap bubble hovering in midair. Beautiful, miraculous, but one wrong move away from vanishing. They ate in silence, spoon scraping bowl, the radio humming low in the background with oldies from the 60s. David clung to the simple normalcy of the moment, afraid to hope too much. After breakfast, he packed their lunches, peanut butter sandwiches, apples, a few cookies. Same as every day. Routine was important. Routine was survival. "Ready, bud?" he asked, crouching to zip Max's coat. Max nodded, eyes serious. At Harvard, David signed in at the janitorial office, exchanging a few quiet greetings with the other night shift workers just finishing up. They were good people, mostly immigrants, retirees needing extra money, folks forgotten by the shine of the Ivy League world. David fit right in. They moved through the empty early morning halls, past towering libraries and stone statues of men, long dead, but never forgotten. Max clutched his notebook tightly, walking so close that his shoulder brushed David's side with each step. David couldn't help but notice how Max's eyes lingered on the math lecture flyers pinned to bulletin boards, the chalked formulas left on abandoned blackboards. It wasn't the curiosity of a passing glance. It was the gaze of recognition, like a musician hearing a familiar song in a foreign land. They reached classroom 3B. David hesitated before unlocking the door, his heart thudding. Would she be there again? The thought unsettled him, and not just because she had seen him doing something he shouldn't, scribbling equations instead of mopping floors. It was the way she had played that guitar. Softly, kindly, like she understood. The room was empty. Only the faint scent of wood polish and chalk dust hung in the air. David felt a flicker of disappointment, quickly quashed. He needed to focus. Work came first. Always. He set Max up in a corner with crayons and coloring sheets, basic math puzzles he'd printed off from the library. Max accepted them solemnly, head bowed, the faintest spark of eagerness in his small frame. David turned to his work, falling into the steady rhythm of cleaning, dusting, sweeping, organizing. Hours passed in slow, deliberate beats. At mid-morning, as he wiped down the blackboard, he couldn't resist. He picked up a piece of chalk, heart hammering, and scrawled a simple equation. Nothing fancy, just a linear graph, slope-intercept form, high school stuff. He finished wiping the rest of the board clean, but left the tiny graph in the corner like a hidden treasure. Max noticed. Of course he did. The boy stood slowly, crayon slipping from his fingers, and walked to the board. He studied the graph with an intensity that made David's throat tighten. Max reached for the chalk, then hesitated, glancing back at his father. David gave a small nod. Max, hand trembling, drew a second line on the graph, this one with a steeper slope. David walked over, kneeling beside him. "Good," he said softly. "See how it rises faster? That means it has a bigger slope." Max didn't reply, but a tiny smile, almost invisible, ghosted across his lips. It was more than David had dared to dream. They spent the next half hour like that, building a miniature world out of numbers. David asked gentle questions, and Max responded, not with words, but with chalk marks, arrows, careful numbers in the margins, a silent language, reborn. And then, without warning, the classroom door creaked open. David turned, heart lurching. There she was, the woman with the guitar. This time she carried no instrument, only a slim leather-bound notebook tucked under her arm. She wore a navy blue coat, hair tied back, a few strands escaping to frame her face. She smiled, warm, tentative, and stepped inside. David rose slowly, wiping his chalk-covered hands on his jeans. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, her voice rich and low, with the faintest trace of New England in the vowels. David shook his head, suddenly self-conscious. "I'm Claire Hamilton," she said, offering her hand. He hesitated a beat too long before taking it. His calloused palm engulfed her slender one. "David Miller," he managed. Her eyes flickered to Max, who stood frozen by the board, still clutching the chalk. "And this must be your son," Claire said softly. David nodded. "Max." Claire knelt down, making herself small, non-threatening. "Hi, Max. I saw you working on those graphs. You're pretty good." Max blinked. He didn't run. He didn't hide. Instead, after a long pause, he lifted his notebook and showed her his scrawled equations. Claire's face lit up like sunrise. "Well," she said, genuine admiration coloring her voice. "Looks like we've got a real mathematician here." David's chest tightened with a complex cocktail of pride and fear. Pride, for the boy Max was. Fear, for the world that might break him if it knew. Claire straightened, meeting David's gaze. "I'm a professor here," she said, almost apologetically. "Mathematics and applied music theory." David raised an eyebrow. She smiled. "Yes, it's a weird combination. Long story." He found himself smiling back, surprising himself. Claire hesitated, then added, "I come here sometimes, after hours, to clear my head. It's quieter when the world is asleep." David nodded slowly. He understood that more than she could know. Claire glanced at the blackboard, the small island of chalked equations. "You know," she said lightly, "if you ever wanted to sit in on a class, I could arrange it. No pressure. Just, if you're interested." David laughed, a soft, rusty sound. "I'm a janitor." Claire's smile didn't waver. "I'm a professor. Doesn't mean we can't both love math." Something unspoken passed between them, an understanding, a truce, and just maybe, the first chord of something else. Something neither had dared to hope for in a very long time. The next night, David found himself strangely anxious as he packed his work bag. He checked the apartment's thermostat twice to make sure Max would be warm enough, even though the child rarely complained. He watched Max slide his battered notebook into his backpack without a word. There was a new energy to the boy, still fragile, still flickering, but it was there, undeniable. David couldn't quite explain it, but something had shifted since the encounter with Claire Hamilton. A thread of connection had been spun, delicate but strong, tugging them forward into something unknown. As they walked through the crisp evening air toward Harvard, Max held his father's hand a little tighter. Above them, the stars blinked through the thin winter clouds, and the air smelled of wood smoke and frozen leaves. It was the kind of night that made memories feel closer than usual, like old friends watching from the wings. Inside the university, the world narrowed to dim corridors and polished floors. David signed in at the janitor's office, nodding absently at the security guard. He felt a knot of nervous anticipation low in his gut. Was she here tonight? He wasn't sure whether he hoped the answer would be yes or no. In classroom 3B, Max immediately settled into his routine, pulling out his notebook and crayons. David busied himself with the mop and cleaning supplies, trying not to look toward the door too often. An hour passed. The clock's steady tick filled the silence. No Claire. David told himself not to be disappointed. She had probably just been passing through. Professors were busy people, important people. She had offered kindness, nothing more. Still, when the soft sound of footsteps echoed down the hall around 2 a.m., David's heart leapt before he could stop it. Claire appeared in the doorway, a guitar slung over her shoulder, like a companion too familiar to notice. She wore jeans, a thick cream-colored sweater, and a faded brown leather jacket that looked older than either of them. She hesitated for a moment, as if seeking permission. David smiled, small but real, and nodded. Claire stepped inside, setting her guitar case carefully on one of the front benches. She opened it with reverence, like a priestess unveiling a sacred relic. The guitar was old, a rich, honey-colored Martin, its body worn smooth by countless songs. Claire tuned it quickly, fingers sure and graceful, then sat cross-legged on a desk at the front of the room. David leaned against the back wall, arms crossed loosely, watching. Max crept closer, drawn like a moth to the faint golden glow of the music. Claire didn't speak. She just played. A soft, lilting melody filled the room. something between a lullaby and a hymn. The notes floated upward, wrapping around the cold, clinical walls, breathing life into a space meant for logic and reason. David closed his eyes. The song was simple, but it hit something deep inside him, something raw and unhealed. He remembered sitting on a porch swing with Emily, long before Max was born, watching fireflies dance in the sticky summer twilight. He remembered laughter, easy and abundant. Dreams spoken aloud without fear of their fragility. When he opened his eyes, he found Max standing near Claire, swaying slightly in time with the music. Claire smiled at him, never missing a beat, and shifted into a brighter, more playful tune, an old American folk song about trains and rivers and journeys into the unknown. Max grinned, an actual, honest-to-God grin, and clapped his hands. David felt his throat close with emotion. This was what he had been afraid to hope for. Not just survival, not just going through the motions, but joy, real, unguarded joy. When the song ended, Claire set the guitar aside gently and looked up at them. "I don't usually have an audience," she said with a laugh. "You two are good for my nerves." David pushed off the wall, approaching slowly. "You're good," he said simply. Claire shrugged, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "It's just something I do when life gets too heavy." David nodded. "Yeah, I get that." There was a brief, easy silence, the kind that exists between people who understand grief, even without sharing all the details. Claire turned her attention to Max, who was still hovering near the guitar, wide-eyed. "Would you like to try?" she asked softly. Max looked up at David, seeking approval. David knelt beside him. "If you want to, buddy." Max hesitated only a moment before nodding. Claire handed him the guitar carefully, guiding his small fingers to the strings. The instrument was far too big for him, but he strummed a few awkward notes, giggling at the funny, jangling sound. Claire laughed with him, a rich, musical sound that filled the room. "You're a natural," she teased gently. David watched, his heart full to bursting. This woman, this stranger, had reached Max in ways that therapy sessions, grief counselors, and endless nights of whispered reassurances had not. Music. Simple, human connection. No grand gestures. No complicated solutions. Just kindness, patience, presence. As Max explored the guitar, Claire moved closer to David. "I meant what I said yesterday," she said quietly. "If you ever want it, I could tutor him. Help nurture what's already there." David swallowed hard. "You really think he's special?" Claire smiled, soft and certain. "I think he's extraordinary." David glanced at his son, so small, so determined, and something inside him shifted. Maybe it was time to stop surviving. Maybe it was time to start living again. "I'd like that," he said finally, voice rough. Claire's smile widened, not triumphant, but relieved, as if she too had been waiting for this moment. The guitar hummed under Max's clumsy fingers. The old lecture hall, so often filled with dry lectures and fading ambitions, now held something precious. Hope. David let out a slow breath, the knot in his chest loosening for the first time in what felt like forever. Maybe beginnings didn't always announce themselves with fanfare. Sometimes they crept in on quiet notes in the middle of the night, when the world was asleep, and only the heart was listening. The following nights became something of an unspoken ritual. While David mopped floors and dusted forgotten shelves, Claire would slip quietly into classroom 3B, guitar slung over her back like an old friend. She never came with a grand entrance, never with expectations, just soft music, patience, and a smile that said, "Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." Max blossomed in her presence. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was in the small things. the way he sat a little taller when she played, the way his pencil sketches evolved from jagged, anxious lines to gentle, looping equations, the way he laughed, real and full, when he strummed a wrong note and Claire exaggerated a theatrical grimace. David watched it all from the sidelines, heart heavy and light at the same time. He knew healing wasn't supposed to look like a lightning strike. It was supposed to look exactly like this. Slow, almost imperceptible, until one day you realized the wound had closed. Tonight, Claire tuned her guitar with quick, expert hands, then glanced over at Max with a playful glint in her eye. "Do you know this land is your land?" she asked. Max shook his head shyly. Claire winked. "Well, you're about to." She began to play. Easy, rhythmic chords, her foot tapping lightly against the floor. Her voice was low and warm, the kind that wrapped around a room like a familiar quilt. It wasn't a performance. It was an invitation. David found himself humming under his breath before he realized it. Memories flooded back. Road trips across dusty highways, campfires under endless stars, Emily's hand in his at small-town parades. The song wasn't just music. It was America. The America of old pickup trucks, 4th of July sparklers, and neighborhoods where everyone knew your name. Max clapped in time, shyly at first, then with growing confidence. When Claire beckoned, he joined her at the front of the room, strumming the simplest chords she had taught him the night before. It was clumsy. It was messy. It was beautiful. After the song faded into a soft echo, Claire set the guitar aside and sat cross-legged on the floor with Max. They pulled out his battered notebook, where equations and drawings now tumbled together in joyful chaos. David approached, wiping his hands on a ragged cloth. He crouched down, studying Max's newest work. A pattern jumped out immediately. Linear graphs, simple but precise. And more than that, the beginnings of mathematical intuition, the rarest kind of genius. Claire saw it too. Her eyes shone with excitement. "He's not just mimicking," she said softly, careful not to overwhelm. "He understands." David stared at his son, stunned. It had taken months of silence, months of frozen grief, and yet here was Max, building bridges out of numbers, finding his way back to the world one equation at a time. Claire turned a page in the notebook. She pointed to a small, wobbly graph Max had drawn. "Look here," she said, voice low. "He's visualizing slope as movement, not just as numbers on a page." David blinked. That was advanced thinking, something most college freshmen struggled to grasp. He looked at Max, who was watching them both with solemn curiosity, as if unsure whether he had done something wrong. David reached out, brushing a hand gently over Max's hair. "You did good, buddy," he said, voice rough with unshed tears. "Real good." Max smiled, a full, unguarded smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes and shattered David's heart in the best way possible. Claire leaned back on her hands, studying them. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "we have an early talent program here at Harvard. It's unofficial, really. Just a handful of professors volunteering time. No grades, no pressure. Just nurturing." David stiffened instinctively. The word Harvard still carried too much weight, too many ghosts of what might have been. He looked at Max, his messy hair, his too thin frame, the fierce intelligence burning behind his quiet gaze. Could he really open that door for him? Was it safe? Claire must have sensed his hesitation. She added softly, "It wouldn't be about making him into something he's not. It would be about giving him space to become who he already is." David swallowed hard. He thought about Emily, about the promises they had whispered over Max's crib. "We'll give him everything. Not riches, not fame, just a chance to dream big enough to touch the stars." Maybe it wasn't too late to keep that promise. David nodded slowly. "We'll think about it," he said. Claire smiled, radiant with understanding. "No rush. Healing first. Always." The janitor's closet key jangled in David's pocket. His shift was nearly over. Morning would come soon, spilling sunlight across the marble floors, filling the world with noise again. But here, in this quiet moment, surrounded by music and numbers and fragile new beginnings, David felt something he hadn't dared feel in months. Hope. It wasn't loud. It wasn't triumphant. It was a single, steady note, a heartbeat rediscovered in the ruins of what had been. He looked at Claire, at Max, and knew. Whatever came next, they wouldn't have to face it alone. The snow fell heavier that night, blanketing Cambridge in thick, muffling white. It softened the edges of the world, made everything quieter, slower, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. David tightened Max's scarf around his neck, brushing a gentle hand over the boy's shaggy hair, before they stepped out of their apartment and into the whirling cold. Max clutched his notebook close to his chest, his small body leaning instinctively into his father's side for warmth. Harvard's halls welcomed them with their usual emptiness. The janitor's key clicked in the lock of classroom 3B, and David pushed the door open to the familiar creak, flicking on the lights. Tonight, Claire wasn't there yet. David felt a small pang of disappointment, quickly followed by guilt. She didn't owe them anything. And yet, her presence had become a quiet lifeline in their slow journey back to life. Max set his things down and moved toward the blackboard without hesitation, chalk in hand. David watched, heart swelling with pride and awe, as his son carefully copied a graph he must have memorized from the previous night. It was simple. A basic line crossing the y-axis, tilting upward at a neat angle. But it was also profound. Max wasn't just surviving anymore. He was building something. David leaned his mop against the wall and picked up a piece of chalk himself. Side by side, father and son began to draw. Lines, curves, parabolas, systems of equations blossoming like snowflakes across the vast blackboard. For the first time in months, David allowed himself to be completely present. Not thinking about the bills unpaid, not worrying about the silent weight of grief, not regretting the dreams abandoned long ago. Just here, just now, with Max, with the numbers, with the quiet joy of something being created instead of lost. As the minutes slipped by, Max grew more daring. He pointed to David's curve and traced a second one that intersected it, a primitive attempt at graphing two variables together. David chuckled low in his throat. "You're making this complicated, kiddo." Max grinned, the lopsided smile so reminiscent of Emily that David's heart ached with bittersweet love. The door creaked again. Both David and Max turned. Claire stood there, cheeks pink from the cold, hair dusted lightly with snow. She carried no guitar tonight, only herself, wrapped in a navy pea coat that made her look both commanding and somehow impossibly small against the enormity of the lecture hall. Her eyes softened at the sight before her, a blackboard covered not with dry lecture notes, but with the living, breathing language of a boy and his father trying to find their way back to each other. "Looks like I'm interrupting a masterpiece," she said, voice low and teasing. David shrugged, smiling. "We're just doodling." Claire stepped closer, studying Max's intersecting lines. "This," she said, pointing gently, "is actually the foundation of solving systems of equations. He's visualizing relationships between two different sets of data. That's advanced." David laughed under his breath. "He thinks it's a game." Claire met his eyes. "It is a game, the best kind." Max stood proudly beside his work, small hands dusted with chalk. Claire crouched to his level. "Would you like to learn something cool?" she asked. Max nodded, Claire pulled a few colored chalks from her coat pocket, blue, green, red, and showed Max how different slopes could talk to each other on the graph, how lines could meet or run parallel forever, depending on the story you wanted to tell. Max watched, entranced, absorbing every word. David stood back, letting the scene wash over him. He realized, suddenly, that it wasn't just Max healing. He was, too. He wasn't just cleaning floors anymore. He wasn't just a man who had lost everything. He was a father who still had something precious left to give. Claire caught his gaze over Max's head and smiled. Small, knowing, kind. There was no pity in her look, only respect, and something warmer that David dared not name yet. The snow continued to fall outside, thick and steady. Inside, the blackboard bloomed with color. Numbers, symbols, lines of impossible beauty. A secret garden, growing in the dead of winter. When Max finally tired, curling up on a bench with his notebook cradled in his arms like a beloved toy, Claire and David sat quietly together at the back of the room. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence between them was comfortable, almost sacred. Finally, Claire broke it. "You know," she said, voice soft, "I didn't just stumble into that classroom the other night." David raised an eyebrow. Claire smiled, a little sheepish. "I come here sometimes, late at night, when the university is sleeping, when the noise dies down, and it's just me and the math." David nodded slowly. "It's different at night." Claire looked out across the room at the snow falling thick against the high windows. "It feels more honest somehow," she said. "Less about competition, more about wonder." David studied her profile, the strong line of her jaw, the determined set of her shoulders, and felt something stir in his chest, not just attraction, recognition. Here was another soul who understood what it meant to find beauty in the forgotten corners, to cling to wonder even when the world expected cynicism. Claire turned back to him, her eyes serious. "Max is remarkable, but so are you, David." He opened his mouth to deflect, to make a joke, but she held up a hand. "I mean it," she said gently. "You didn't just survive losing her. You kept living. You showed up. For him. For yourself." David swallowed hard, the words catching in his throat. It had been so long since anyone had seen him. Really seen him. Claire smiled, a little sad, a little hopeful. "That matters," she said. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward 3 a.m. Max slept peacefully nearby, surrounded by scribbled dreams in chalk and crayon. David leaned back, breathing in the quiet, the hope, the possibility. Maybe life wasn't about giant victories. Maybe it was about small, stubborn acts of love, over and over again, until something beautiful grew. Maybe healing didn't come all at once. Maybe it came instead, in numbers in the night. Morning light spilled across the snow-blanketed city like liquid gold. But inside Harvard's cavernous halls, the world remained wrapped in quiet shadows. David sat at the back of classroom 3B, sipping lukewarm coffee from a chipped thermos. Max sat cross-legged on the floor, scribbling furiously in his notebook, tongue poking out slightly in concentration. Claire stood at the blackboard, chalk dancing in her hand, sketching out simple problems that grew steadily more complex as the minutes ticked by. It was their third early morning together, their own strange little school before the rest of the world even woke up. David never said it out loud, but these hours, before the sun fully rose, before the buildings filled with noise and deadlines and rushing feet, were sacred. It felt like they had carved out a secret space where hope could breathe. Claire finished another equation and stepped back, tilting her head to survey her work. She turned to Max with an encouraging smile. "Okay, Genius, she teased lightly. Your turn. Max approached the board, small hands clutching a piece of blue chalk. He studied the problem, 3 simple variables and 2 linear equations, and without hesitation, he began to solve it. David watched, heart pounding. It wasn't just that Max was right. It was the way he was right. Fluid. Natural, as if he thought in numbers the way other kids thought in stories or pictures. Claire knelt beside him, tapping her chin thoughtfully. "Do you see what you just did, Max?" she asked. Max looked up, brow furrowed. "You didn't just solve it," Claire said, voice low and full of wonder. "You understood it." David rubbed a hand over his mouth, overwhelmed. He had always known Max was bright, but this was something else entirely. Something rare. Something precious. Claire turned to David, her face serious now. "I wasn't exaggerating," she said quietly. "Max has an intuitive grasp of higher-level mathematics, not memorization. Understanding. That's a gift, David." David swallowed hard. His throat felt thick. Guilt pricked at him. How much had Max suffered these past months, trapped inside his own mind, without anyone seeing what brilliance was quietly blooming? Claire seemed to sense his thoughts. "You didn't fail him," she said gently. "You saved him. You gave him space to survive long enough to get here." David looked away, blinking fast. Max erased the board with vigorous strokes and eagerly awaited the next challenge. Claire straightened, brushing chalk dust from her jeans. "I've been thinking," she said. "There's a summer program here at Harvard for young, exceptional minds. It's not about grades or pressure. It's about exploration, creativity." David hesitated. Harvard. The name still felt impossibly big, impossibly distant from the narrow world he and Max had built out of necessity. He cleared his throat. "How much does it cost?" Claire smiled, as if she'd been expecting the question. "For most, a lot," she said honestly. "But for kids like Max, kids with true exceptional ability, there are scholarships, full rides. I could help nominate him." David rubbed the back of his neck. The idea of Max in a classroom full of privileged, polished prodigies was daunting. Would they accept a janitor's son with second-hand clothes and scars too deep for words? Claire must have read the hesitation on his face. "It's not about where he comes from," she said firmly. "It's about where he's going." Max wandered back over, notebook in hand, oblivious to the adult world shifting quietly around him. David crouched to Max's level. "You'd have to work hard, buddy," he said gently. "Really hard." Max tilted his head, considering. "And you'd be around other kids who love numbers too." Max's eyes lit up, a slow, cautious brightness. "And you'd have a teacher who thinks you're amazing," David added, glancing at Claire. Max's smile, when it came, was small but true. David closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deep. Emily would have wanted this. She would have insisted on it. Opening his eyes, he nodded slowly. "Let's do it." Claire beamed. "We'll start slow. I'll prep him for the placement exam. No pressure, just fun." David chuckled dryly. "Your idea of fun must be different than mine." Claire grinned. "Guilty." The bell tower outside began to chime, deep notes reverberating through the stone walls. Daylight flooded the windows, banishing the last of the night's quiet magic. Their hidden world was slipping back behind the veil. The day was beginning. Max packed his notebook carefully, as if it were made of glass. David watched him, a lump in his throat. It was a long road ahead. Therapy sessions still needed. Quiet nights filled with whispered memories of Emily. Tears yet to be shed. Wounds yet to be fully healed. But for the first time in what felt like forever, David wasn't afraid of the road. He had Max. He had hope. And maybe if he let himself believe it, He had the beginnings of something with Claire. Not to replace what was lost. Never that. But to remind him that life, stubborn and beautiful, had a way of finding its own music again, even after the silence. Claire slung her guitar case over her shoulder, pausing at the door. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked. David hesitated, then smiled. "Wouldn't miss it." They stepped out into the crisp morning air, the snow crunching beneath their boots, the sky brightening with the first blush of sunrise. Ahead of them lay a new day, unwritten and waiting. And this time, David thought, they were ready to meet it. Together, the days began to stretch longer, inching toward spring. The winter still clung stubbornly to the edges of Cambridge. In the early mornings, before the city stirred, Classroom 3B became something almost holy. A sanctuary of quiet growth, chalk dust, music, and whispered encouragements. Max blossomed under Claire's gentle guidance. He absorbed concepts at a staggering pace, not through rote memorization, but through some innate, shimmering grasp of the patterns that underpinned the world. It was in the way he solved equations, how he mapped numbers in flowing arcs rather than rigid lines, as if he could see the beauty of mathematics as easily as most children saw colors. David watched with awe, gratitude, and a gnawing fear he couldn't shake. Max wasn't just smart, he was extraordinary. And extraordinary things, David knew too well, came with extraordinary risks. One afternoon, as the last golden light filtered into the lecture hall, Claire packed away Max's worksheets and turned to David with a look that made his stomach tighten. "We need to talk about the summer program," she said. David nodded slowly. He had known this conversation was coming. Claire pulled a folder from her bag and laid it on a desk. Inside were forms, applications, scholarship information, letters of recommendation already penned by Claire herself. David leafed through the papers, heart hammering. Everything about it felt too big, too official. Harvard, scholarships. Max among students whose parents were CEOs and surgeons, not janitors who barely scraped rent together each month. Claire must have seen the hesitation flicker across his face. "It's just paperwork for now," she said gently. "Nothing binding." David closed the folder and looked away, jaw tight. "It's not that I'm not proud," he said, voice low. "It's just—" He struggled for words. Claire waited, patient. "I don't want him to get hurt," David finished finally. "He's just starting to come back to life. If he gets thrown into a world where he's different, where he doesn't fit—" David shook his head. "I can't risk losing him again." Claire stepped closer, her voice steady. "David, protecting him doesn't mean holding him back. It means giving him the tools to fly, and the wings strong enough to come home if he falls." David exhaled shakily. He admired how Claire spoke, without sugarcoating, without making promises she couldn't keep. She wasn't offering magic. She was offering belief. "Besides," Claire added, a small smile playing at her lips, "he won't be doing this alone. He'll have us." David glanced at Max, who sat nearby, humming quietly to himself as he sketched a series of intricate, intersecting graphs. Us. The word felt foreign and dangerously precious. David thought of Emily. How fiercely she had fought for joy, even when life battered them. She would have said yes. She would have told David that Max deserved a world big enough for his dreams. He squared his shoulders. "What would we need to do?" he asked. Claire's face lit up with quiet triumph, not pride, but a deep, sincere happiness. "We start with a mock placement exam," she said. "Nothing scary, just to get him used to the idea. And I'll be there every step of the way." David chuckled under his breath. "I'm not worried about Max handling it." Claire grinned. "No, you're worried about you." He laughed, embarrassed but not denying it. "Maybe." Claire nudged his arm lightly. You're doing better than you think." A comfortable silence settled between them, thick with possibilities. Finally, David spoke, his voice rough but sure. "Okay, let's do it." Claire beamed. One step at a time. As if sensing the moment, Max ran over, waving his notebook proudly. He pointed to a fresh page where he had, apparently on his own, discovered the basics of parabolas. Claire let out a low whistle. "You," she said, ruffling his hair, "are going to knock them all dead." Max grinned shyly. David knelt beside him, meeting his son's bright gaze. "You ready for a big adventure, buddy?" he asked. Max nodded solemnly. David pulled him into a hug, holding him tighter than necessary. He whispered against Max's hair, "Whatever happens, I'm proud of you." Max tightened his arms around David's neck, and for a moment, it felt like time folded inward. David's boy, still small enough to carry, but already carrying so much strength inside him. That night, long after the halls emptied and the world outside resumed its clamor, David lay awake in their tiny apartment, listening to Max breathe softly in the next room. He stared at the cracked ceiling, heart pounding with a cocktail of fear and wonder. Could he really dare to believe in something bigger again? Could he dare to believe that not everything beautiful had to be temporary? The next morning, when he packed Max's bag for their shift at Harvard, he slipped Claire's folder inside. A small, stubborn act of faith. A plan, fragile but fiercely real. A plan to believe. The old guitar case sat open on the bench, its velvet lining faded to a dusty blue-gray. Claire tuned the strings with the casual grace of someone who had long ago made music an extension of her own breathing. Max sat cross-legged on the floor, tapping out rhythms on his notebook, while David leaned against the back wall, arms folded loosely, watching them both. It was another late night in classroom 3B. The outside world was lost beneath a blanket of spring rain, drumming steadily against the tall windows, blurring the city lights into a watercolor dream. Claire glanced up at David. "Any requests?" she asked lightly. David chuckled under his breath. "I'm not exactly up to date on today's hits." Claire grinned. "Neither am I." She strummed a few warm-up chords, familiar, comforting, and then settled into a soft, easy rhythm that tugged at something deep inside David's chest. It was an old folk song, one he hadn't heard in decades, one Emily used to hum under her breath while folding laundry or cooking dinner. Small, ordinary moments that had built a life. David closed his eyes. The lyrics floated through the room like smoke. "Catch a falling star and put it in your pocket. Save it for a rainy day." It wasn't a perfect performance. Claire's voice cracked slightly on the high notes, and the guitar buzzed faintly on one worn fret. But it didn't matter. It was real. It was theirs. Max swayed gently, eyes half closed, smiling as if wrapped in a memory too sweet for words. When the song ended, silence settled over the room, heavy and full of things left unsaid. David found himself walking forward, almost without thinking, until he was beside Claire at the front of the room. He reached out, tentative, and she handed him the guitar without hesitation. David sat down on the bench, adjusting the strap awkwardly over his broad shoulders. "It's been years," he murmured. Claire just smiled. Music doesn't forget. David strummed a tentative chord, clumsy but recognizable. The vibrations buzzed up through his fingers, waking up a part of him he had thought long dead. He played a few more chords, fumbling for a tune buried deep in his memory. And then, slowly, he found it. A song older than he was. A simple melody, half lullaby, half prayer, sung by campfires and porch swings and open truck beds under starlit skies. Max watched with wide, awed eyes. Claire tapped her foot softly in time. David's voice was rough, low, worn by years of grief and hard living, but it carried. Carried through the empty room, the empty spaces inside him, filling cracks he hadn't dared touch until now. When the last chord faded, David sat there, head bowed, breathing hard. Claire touched his shoulder gently. "See," she whispered. "Still in you." David looked up, meeting her gaze. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping promises, just a simple truth, spoken in the language of music and memory. He was still here, still capable of creating something beautiful, still alive. Claire sat down beside him, close enough that their knees brushed. Max clambered onto the bench, too, nestling between them, the guitar resting awkwardly across his small lap. Together, they played a messy, broken little song. 3 people trying, failing, laughing, trying again. It was imperfect. It was perfect. When Max finally yawned and sagged against David's side, David gathered him into his arms easily, breathing in the boy's clean, rain-scented hair. Claire stood, packing the guitar away with quiet reverence. "Thank you," David said, voice rough. Claire paused, glancing at him over her shoulder. "For what?" David tightened his hold on Max. "For reminding me that there's more than just surviving." Claire smiled, a real smile, soft and brilliant. "You never forgot," she said. "You just needed someone to play the first note." The rain outside softened into a mist. The night felt less heavy, the world a little more possible. David carried Max down the hallway toward the exit, Claire walking beside him, their steps in easy rhythm. At the main doors, they paused. Claire shifted awkwardly, as if searching for the right words. David beat her to it. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. Claire's answering smile was pure sunlight. "I wouldn't miss it." As they stepped out into the misty night, David realized something remarkable. For the first time since losing Emily, he wasn't carrying his grief alone. It had been divided, shared, lightened, by a boy with numbers in his blood, and a woman with music in her hands. And somehow, impossibly, their broken songs had begun to weave a new melody together. One that spoke of healing, of hope, of love, not in grand fireworks, but in small, stubborn chords, played softly against the darkness. And David, against all odds, was ready to sing along. Spring finally loosened its hesitant grip on Cambridge, trading icy winds for gentle rains and the first tentative blooms along the cracked sidewalks. On Harvard's ancient lawns, crocuses pushed through the soil like promises made real. Inside classroom 3B, David watched Max fidget nervously at one of the student desks, a stubby pencil tapping out a restless rhythm against the wood. Today was different. Today was Max's placement exam. Claire had spent the past few weeks preparing him, blending lessons with songs, turning complex theories into adventures. Max had thrived, so much so that David sometimes caught himself staring at his son in awe, wondering when the quiet, wounded boy had been replaced by this fierce little mind, burning so brightly. Still, David's heart hammered against his ribs as he watched Max now, dressed in his best clothes, an ironed shirt a size too big, second-hand khakis neatly cuffed at the ankles. They hadn't been able to afford anything new. But Claire had said it best. It's not the clothes that will walk him into that room. It's his heart. Claire sat beside David at the back of the hall, a file folder resting on her lap. She gave him a reassuring smile, as if sensing his anxiety. "You're more nervous than he is," she whispered. David chuckled dryly, rubbing a hand over his face. "He's braver than I ever was." Claire touched his forearm lightly, grounding him. "He has your heart," she said, "and your fight." The proctor, a kind-looking woman in her 50s, with silver hair pulled into a neat bun, called Max's name. David's throat closed up. He opened his mouth to offer encouragement, but no words came out. He needn't have worried. Max stood, clutching his notebook like a talisman, and walked toward the front of the room with a solemnity that nearly broke David's heart. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew his father was there. Claire squeezed David's hand once, then released it. They watched in silence as Max settled at a desk near the front, pencil poised, waiting for the signal to begin. The test wasn't designed to trick or humiliate. It was meant to see the child, how he thought, how he solved, how he dreamed through numbers. Still, every second that ticked by felt like a year stretched taut. David tried not to wring his hands, tried not to pace, tried not to imagine every possible outcome. Instead, he focused on Claire's steady presence beside him and the quiet certainty in Max's small, determined frame. The exam lasted an hour. It was the longest hour of David's life. When the proctor finally collected the papers, Max looked up, and this time he did search the room for David. Their eyes met. David smiled, a wide, proud smile he didn't bother hiding. Max grinned back, exhausted but radiant, before hurrying back toward them. Claire crouched to meet him halfway. "You did amazing," she said warmly, even before seeing a single answer. Max flushed with pleasure. David knelt too, ruffling his son's hair. "No matter what happens," he said, voice thick, "I'm proud of you." Max nodded solemnly, as if sealing a vow between them. The results would take a few days to process, a few days of waiting, a few days of hope and terror dancing side by side in David's chest. That evening, after dinner, Claire joined them at their small apartment for the first time. David had worried she might find it too cramped, too worn. But if she noticed the peeling paint or the sagging couch, she gave no sign. She sat cross-legged on the floor with Max, helping him build a castle out of battered Lego bricks, while David made coffee in the tiny kitchen. It was a simple night. Nothing grand. But to David, it felt monumental. When Max finally nodded off, mid-construction, David carried him to bed, tucking the worn quilt around his thin shoulders. He returned to the living room to find Claire curled up on the couch, nursing her coffee, gazing around the room with soft eyes. "This place feels like home," she said. David sat down opposite her, heart thudding. "It's not much," he said, embarrassed. Claire shook her head. "It's everything that matters." They sat in silence for a moment, the quiet hum of the city filtering through the cracked windows. Finally, David found the courage to ask the question that had been gnawing at him. "Why are you doing this?" Claire set down her coffee cup carefully. "Because someone once believed in me," she said. "When I didn't believe in myself. When my world fell apart." David waited, sensing this was a story she hadn't told many. "My father died when I was 12, Claire continued. "My mom didn't handle it well. I got lost. Angry. Thought about dropping out of school. Thought about running away." She smiled sadly. "But my math teacher, Mrs. Reynolds, she didn't give up on me. She stayed after class. She tutored me. She listened. She saw something in me worth saving." Claire looked up, eyes bright. "She changed everything." David swallowed hard. "And now," Claire said softly, "I want to pass it on." David leaned back, the weight of her words settling into his chest. It wasn't pity. It wasn't charity. It was legacy. Hope carried forward like a torch. "I'm glad it's you," he said quietly. Claire smiled, a small, grateful smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "And I'm glad it's you," she whispered. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The night was clear, the stars sharp against the velvet sky. New beginnings didn't always come with fanfare. Sometimes they crept in quietly, through the doorway of a worn apartment, over coffee and broken Lego castles, under the steady gaze of two people daring to believe in second chances. And David, for the first time in a long time, believed he might just be brave enough to take one. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, tucked between grocery store flyers and utility bills. David nearly missed it. An unassuming envelope stamped with the crimson seal of Harvard's summer program. Standing in the cramped entryway of their apartment, fingers trembling, David tore it open. One page, simple words. We are thrilled to offer Max Miller a full scholarship to the Early Scholars Program beginning this June. David sagged against the doorframe, a strange, weightless sensation flooding him. He read the letter twice more, hardly able to believe it. Max. Harvard. Not a dream. Not a maybe. A beginning. Max looked up from the living room floor, where he was carefully fitting Lego bricks together. His eyes widened as he took in David's expression. David crossed the room in 2 strides and scooped him into his arms, spinning him around until Max shrieked with laughter. "You did it, buddy," David said, voice breaking with emotion. "You did it." Max's arms tightened around his father's neck. It was a moment David knew he would carry for the rest of his life, etched into the quiet places of his heart. Later that evening, they met Claire at their usual spot, classroom 3B. The rain had stopped, and a soft golden light slanted through the windows, illuminating the dust motes like tiny stars. When Claire saw the envelope clutched in David's hand, she grinned and dropped her guitar onto a bench. "He got in," David said, still half dazed. Claire whooped, an uncharacteristically wild sound that made Max giggle uncontrollably. She dropped to her knees, arms open wide, and Max barreled into her without hesitation. "You're going to be amazing," she whispered into his hair. "I'm so proud of you." David watched them, something thick and sweet rising in his chest. When Max broke away to proudly show Claire the acceptance letter, David found himself moving closer to her, almost without thinking. Claire straightened, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her face flushed with excitement. "None of this would have happened without you," David said quietly. Claire shook her head. "It was always in him. I just gave it a place to shine." Their eyes met. For a long, aching moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them, the gentle thrum of possibility, the unspoken understanding that something had been building between them, fragile and fierce, from the very first night. David's heart pounded, but he didn't look away. He stepped closer, close enough to see the faint freckles dusting Claire's nose, the hope shimmering in her eyes. "You saved us," he said hoarsely. Claire smiled, soft and certain. "No," she said. "You saved each other. I just tuned the strings." David laughed, a low, incredulous sound. "You're impossible." "And you're stubborn," she teased gently. He reached for her hand then, tentative, reverent. Claire didn't pull away. Her fingers curled into his, fitting like a missing piece he hadn't realized he'd been waiting for. And just like that, without fanfare or fireworks, they crossed a threshold. Not into a perfect fairy tale, but into something real, something earned. Claire squeezed his hand once before letting go, glancing toward Max, who was still engrossed in tracing his acceptance letter with careful fingers. "We should celebrate," she said brightly. David nodded. "What did you have in mind?" Claire grinned mischievously. "Pie." He blinked. "Pie?" "Pie," she confirmed. "There's a diner near here. Open late. Best cherry pie this side of the Charles River." David chuckled, feeling lighter than he had in years. Pie sounds perfect. They gathered their things, Max's notebook, Claire's guitar, and stepped out into the cool spring night together. The diner was a throwback to the 1950s, all chrome and neon and cracked vinyl booths, Max's eyes went wide at the spinning stools and endless pie case. They slid into a booth by the window, and David couldn't stop smiling as Max pressed his nose against the glass, watching the world go by. Claire ordered cherry pie for all three of them, and when the waitress set the plates down, heaping slices glistening with syrupy red filling, Max clapped his hands with glee. They ate slowly, savoring every bite, talking about everything and nothing. David found himself laughing more than he had in months, years maybe. Claire teased him gently about his terrible taste in music. David ribbed her back about her obsession with math jokes, and through it all, Max watched them with shining eyes, a quiet witness to the way healing sometimes looked like pie at midnight, and laughter that bubbled up from nowhere. When the check came, Claire snatched it before David could protest. "My treat," she said firmly. "Consider it a down payment on Max's future Nobel Prize." David shook his head, grinning. "You're something else." "So are you," Claire said, her gaze steady. They stepped out into the night, the city humming quietly around them. David lifted Max into his arms, the boy's head drooping against his shoulder, worn out from excitement and sugar. Claire walked beside them, her hand brushing his every so often, each touch sending a small, electric thrill through David's chest. They didn't speak of tomorrow, didn't make promises. They didn't need to. In the spaces between their words, in the warmth of their shared laughter, in the simple wonder of Max's sleeping face pressed against David's shoulder, everything important had already been said. Somehow, some way, their broken hearts had solved their own impossible equations. Together, the day of the ceremony dawned clear and bright, the kind of crisp early summer morning that smelled of cut grass and possibility. David adjusted Max's collar for the third time, earning an exasperated sigh from the boy. He chuckled under his breath, smoothing the wrinkle anyway. "You look perfect, buddy," David said, his throat tightening at the sight. Max stood tall in his little navy blazer and khaki pants, the official early scholar's pin gleaming proudly on his chest. He clutched a folder of his best work, essays, equations, drawings, his ticket into a world that had once seemed impossibly far away. Claire waited for them by the front steps of the university's old lecture hall, a bouquet of wildflowers in her arms. She wore a simple summer dress, pale blue, and David's heart did a funny little stutter at the sight of her. She smiled as they approached, a smile that somehow wrapped around both of them and stitched itself into David's ribs. "You ready to make history, Max?" she teased lightly. Max gave a solemn nod, clutching his folder tighter. David and Claire exchanged a look, part amusement, part awe. This boy, this miracle. The hall buzzed with quiet excitement as families filtered in, finding seats among the long wooden pews polished by decades of hopeful hands. Max sat between David and Claire, swinging his feet nervously, the tips of his polished shoes not quite touching the floor. David laid a reassuring hand over Max's fidgeting ones. Max glanced up, grinned, and stilled. The director of the Early Scholars program stepped up to the podium, a kind-faced man with glasses perched precariously on his nose. He spoke about resilience, about curiosity, about the stubborn, breathtaking magic of young minds refusing to be boxed in. David barely heard the words. His eyes were on Max, on the slight quiver of his shoulders, the way he sat up straighter when his name was called. "And finally," the director said, smiling warmly, "we recognize Max Miller, whose passion for mathematics and boundless imagination remind us why we do what we do." A smattering of applause. Max's head jerked up in surprise. David squeezed his hand. "Go on," he whispered. Max stood, face flushed but determined, and walked to the front of the hall. He accepted his certificate with a shy nod, then turned to face the room full of strangers. For a moment, he froze, the enormity of it all pressing down. Then, As if on instinct, he pulled something from inside his blazer pocket, a folded piece of lined paper. He unfolded it carefully, smoothing the creases with small, trembling hands. David's breath caught when he saw the heading scrawled in Max's uneven handwriting, "The Midnight Song of Hope." Max cleared his throat. His voice, when it came, was soft but steady. "I wrote a song," he said simply. "It's about my dad, and about Miss Claire, and about believing." A hush fell over the hall. Max began to hum, a clumsy little tune, half sung, half spoken. There were no instruments, no polished performance, just a boy, a heart laid bare, and a melody born from long nights, whispered prayers, and the stubborn refusal to give up. David felt the first tears sting his eyes before Max even finished the first verse. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was everything. When Max finished, there was a beat of silence so pure it hurt. And then, the room erupted into applause. Not polite, not perfunctory, but wild and genuine. David stood, clapping until his palms ached, laughing through his tears. Claire stood beside him, clapping too, her face shining with pride. Max ran back down the aisle and into David's arms. "You were amazing," David whispered fiercely, holding him tight. Max buried his face against his chest, shaking with quiet sobs of release and joy. David felt Claire's hand settle on his back, steady and sure. Together, they held Max. Together, they stood in the golden light. Together, they sang a song no one else could hear, a song woven of loss and hope, sorrow and healing, endings and beginnings. Later, outside on the broad marble steps, as families posed for pictures and children waved certificates like flags, Claire turned to David. "You know," she said, smiling, "I think you saved me too." David blinked, startled. Claire laughed softly, brushing a hand through her hair. "I thought I was just helping you, helping Max." But somewhere along the way, she trailed off, shrugging, a little shy. "I found a home too." David reached for her hand, no hesitation this time. Her fingers slid into his like a promise. They didn't need grand speeches. They didn't need a perfect plan. They had this. Each other. Max. The life they were building, brick by careful brick, chord by careful chord. The brightest songs, David realized, weren't sung by perfect voices. They were sung by broken ones that kept singing anyway. And theirs, messy, stubborn, full of cracks and light, was the most beautiful of all. We'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Feel free to share your city, your little corner of the world, in the comments below. It's always a joy to see how far and wide our community of kind hearts reaches. If you find hope and comfort in stories like this, we warmly invite you to subscribe and be part of our growing family. Your presence here truly matters. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts for spending a few moments of your day with us. It's a privilege to share these journeys with you.